wind howled through the dense forest as Mark guided his truck down a narrow, overgrown road. The path seemed like it hadn't been touched in decades, its edges lost to brambles and creeping vines. He glanced at the map he'd found in an antique store, tracing the faded lines that led to a forgotten village. The locals had scoffed when he mentioned it. There's nothing out there but ghosts. Their warning lingered in his mind, but curiosity won out. The allure of discovering something untouched by modern hands was too tempting. As the truck creaked around a bend, the trees gave way, revealing a desolate sight. At the foot of a mist-covered hill lay the village. Small, decaying houses lined the dirt path, their windows shattered, roofs sagging under years of neglect. Something was unsettling about the silence that enveloped the place. Not a single bird sang, and even the wind seemed to avoid the village. Mark stepped out of the truck, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The village stood still, an eerie monument to a forgotten past. Yet, beneath the calm, he felt something wrong. He hesitated, questioning if he should turn back, but the pull of the unknown drew him further in. Unbeknownst to him, his arrival had already disturbed something ancient and restless. The village was a labyrinth of decay. Mark noticed how time had gnawed away at everything as he walked further down the path. The buildings were barely more than husks, their once sturdy frames now fragile, as if a mere touch would send them crumbling to dust. The air felt thick and oppressive, and every step he took seemed to echo louder than it should in the quiet. He paused in front of what must have once been a church, its door hanging ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. He thought he saw a shadow move inside for a brief moment, but when he blinked, there was nothing. Mark frowned, convincing himself his mind was playing tricks on him. Yet the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, as if warning him of something unseen. He continued walking, passing an old well at the center of the village. The stone was cracked and covered in moss, but there was something strange about it. The well seemed deeper than it should be, and a faint, rhythmic tapping sound echoed from within. He peered over the edge but saw only darkness. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the village, carrying with it the faintest sound of a whisper. He strained to hear it, but it vanished just as quickly as it had come. A chill ran down his spine as the sense of being watched grew stronger. Mark moved cautiously through the village, his footsteps crunching on the brittle leaves scattered across the ground. The oppressive silence around him felt almost tangible. He stopped in front of a dilapidated house, its windows dark and hollow, like eyes watching his every move. As he strained to listen to his surroundings, he began to hear something faint, just at the edge of perception. Whispers, barely audible, but unmistakable. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but the voices were too distinct, too deliberate. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, their words jumbled and unintelligible. His heart began to race. Was it possible the village wasn't as empty as it appeared? He stepped closer to one of the houses, peering through a broken window, but saw only darkness within. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, clearer, as if the voices were drawing nearer. Mark stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. He quickly scrambled to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. He looked around, but there was no one there. Only the village, still and lifeless, as it had been moments before. Yet the whispers remained, circling him like invisible specters. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking, it was clear they weren't happy about his presence. He swallowed hard, trying to shake off the growing unease. The village wasn't just abandoned. It was haunted by the voices of those long dead. The air grew colder as Mark approached the village's outskirts. His breath came out in small, visible puffs as he neared a crumbling stone house at the edge of the tree line. Something about this place felt particularly ominous. He hesitated before stepping inside. The whispers were louder here, almost frantic, but still beyond his comprehension. As he entered, the door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty rooms. Inside, the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols carved deep into the wood. Dust motes floated lazily in the thin shafts of light that managed to slip through cracks in the ceiling. Mark stepped deeper into the house, his footsteps stirring up the dust beneath his feet. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was freezing. His skin prickled as a wave of dread washed over him. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the room, half shrouded in shadow. It was a woman, her face obscured by long tangled hair. She wore a tattered dress, her form barely solid. For a moment she was there, and then, gone. Mark's heart skipped a beat as she reappeared, closer this time, her eyes now fixed on him. "Leave," she whispered, her voice carrying a low, menacing tone. Mark backed away slowly, his breath hitching in his throat. The figure flickered, fading in and out of existence, but her gaze never wavered. "You must leave," she repeated, her voice echoing in the cold, dead air. Mark left the house in a daze, the woman's warning echoing in his mind. His hands trembled as he walked, the cold air biting at his skin. There was something deeply wrong with this village, something ancient and dark. He needed answers. As he wandered through the overgrown streets, his eyes caught sight of an old building tucked away at the end of a narrow path. Its sign was worn, but he could make out the faded letters. Village Records. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust covered everything, from the shelves lined with books to the floor beneath his boots. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on a small table in the corner. An old journal lay there, untouched by time. Mark's fingers brushed against the leather cover as he opened it, flipping through the brittle pages. The handwriting was scrawled, uneven, as if written in haste. The journal belonged to the village's former leader. As Mark read, a terrible story unfolded. Centuries ago, the villagers had made a deal with a mysterious stranger who promised prosperity in exchange for loyalty to dark forces. At first, the village thrived, but soon strange things began to happen. Illnesses, disappearances, unnatural deaths. Realizing their mistake, the villagers tried to break the pact, but it was too late. The stranger cursed the village, dooming their souls to wander forever. Mark's heart raced as he read the final entry. "We are trapped, forever bound to this land by the blood we spilled." Mark's eyes lingered on the last words of the journal. He could almost feel the weight of the villagers' desperation in the hurried strokes of the pen. His mind raced with questions, but the most pressing one was clear. How could he escape this cursed village? A strange pull guided him outside, leading him to the center of the village. There, in the open clearing, was a circle of stones, weathered, ancient, and radiating a sense of dark power. As he approached, Mark felt a wave of nausea roll through him. His body trembled as if every instinct was screaming for him to turn back. But something compelled him forward. At the center of the circle lay an altar, its surface stained with what looked like centuries-old blood. Symbols, similar to the ones he'd seen in the house, were carved into the stone. He could almost hear the faint echo of chants, whispers from another time. Mark knelt by the altar, his breath shallow as he examined the markings. The journal had mentioned a ritual, one that tied the souls of the villagers to this place. He realized with growing horror that the ritual was never completed. The dark forces the villagers had tried to summon were still bound here, waiting for something or someone to finish what had been started. Mark stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath the stones seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the whispers grew louder in his mind. Whatever was sealed here, it wasn't going to stay trapped for much longer. Mark's pulse quickened as he stepped away from the cursed altar. Every instinct told him to leave the village as quickly as possible. He hurried back down the overgrown path toward his truck, barely able to keep his panic in check. The village seemed quieter now, as though holding its breath. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an unnerving stillness. Reaching the truck, Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. As he turned the ignition, the engine sputtered but wouldn't start. He cursed under his breath, trying again, but the truck remained dead. Desperation clawed at him. He looked out the windshield, eyes scanning the empty road ahead. There had to be another way out. But as he glanced behind him, his heart sank. The narrow road he had driven in on was gone, swallowed by the thick forest. No path, no tire marks, just trees, pressing in from all sides. Mark jumped out of the truck, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He began running, hoping to find another way out, But every path seemed to lead him back to the village. The buildings loomed in the distance, like ghosts that refused to let him go. It was as though the village itself was alive, a labyrinth designed to trap him. Panic surged through him as he realized the truth. There was no escape. The village had claimed him, just as it had claimed those before him. Mark stood at the edge of the village, his chest heaving with exhaustion and fear. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating him. The silence was deafening, but the whispers soon returned, louder now, more urgent. They swirled around him like a storm, voices overlapping, pleading, threatening. He clenched his fists, trying to block them out, but the air seemed to hum with their intensity. As he staggered through the narrow streets, the shadows lengthened. Ghostly figures began to appear. At first, just flickers at the edge of his vision, but soon they grew more solid. Pale faces, twisted in pain, stared at him from the windows of crumbling houses. Their hollow eyes followed his every move. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to avoid their gaze, but the figures multiplied, surrounding him. Suddenly he felt a cold hand brush against his arm. He spun around, but there was no one there. Another touch, this time on his neck. The sensation was unmistakable. Something was reaching for him, trying to drag him into the darkness. His breathing became ragged as the figures closed in, their whispers now a cacophony of sorrow and anger. He stumbled back, tripping over a loose stone, and fell to the ground. Above him, the sky had darkened, the last rays of light disappearing behind a thick layer of clouds. The spirits grew closer, their cold presence suffocating him, and Mark realized he was running out of time. If he didn't find a way to break the curse soon, he would become just another lost soul, trapped in the village forever. Mark sat on the cold, damp ground, his heart pounding in his chest as the apparitions circled closer. He had read about the curse in the journal and had felt the weight of the villagers' doomed fate, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer terror of facing it himself. The realization that he might never leave this village, that he might become another lost soul, gnawed at him, pushing him to the brink of panic. But then, a thought pierced through his fear. The journal had spoken of a ritual, one that had bound the villagers' souls to this land. If the ritual was the cause, perhaps it could also be the solution. He remembered the symbols he had seen etched into the altar, the strange carvings that hinted at some dark, ancient magic. His only chance of escape was to confront whatever dark force had cursed the village and find a way to undo it. With renewed determination, Mark pushed himself to his feet. His legs trembled, but he forced himself to move. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more menacing, but he ignored them. He headed back toward the center of the village, toward the stone circle where the ritual had been performed. The wind picked up as he approached, howling through the trees like the cries of the damned. The altar loomed ahead, its surface glistening in the pale moonlight. Mark knew this was his only chance. Whatever power had been invoked here centuries ago, he would have to face it head-on if he wanted to survive. The air around the altar crackled with malevolent energy as Mark approached, his heart hammering in his chest. The stone circle seemed to pulse beneath his feet, alive with the power of the curse that had imprisoned the villagers for centuries. He could feel the spirits watching him, their cold, unseen presence pressing in on him from all sides. Mark swallowed hard, steeling himself for what was to come. He knelt before the altar, running his fingers over the ancient symbols carved into the stone. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what he had learned from the journal. The ritual had required blood, sacrifice, to bind the villagers to this cursed fate. But perhaps there was a way to reverse it. He fumbled in his pocket for the small pocket knife he always carried, its cold metal handle reassuring against his skin. He had no idea if this would work, but he had no other choice. As he drew the blade across his palm, the spirits around him grew restless. The whispers turned to frantic wails, and the air seemed to thicken with their anger. Mark gritted his teeth against the pain, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the altar. The ground beneath him trembled, and a low, guttural growl echoed from deep within the earth. The shadows around the altar seemed to come alive, swirling together to form a figure, an entity made of darkness and rage. The figure towered over Mark, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. It was the source of the curse, the force that had claimed the village and its people. Mark stood his ground, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. The entity loomed closer, its voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. "You are too late," it hissed, its words like poison in the air. But Mark tightened his grip on the knife, ready to do whatever it took to end the curse, no matter the cost. The dark figure loomed over Mark, its presence suffocating, as though the very air had been drained from his lungs. The ground beneath him shook with an unnatural force, and the air was thick with the screams of tormented souls. Mark stood his ground, despite the terror that threatened to freeze him in place. He could feel the blood from his palm dripping onto the altar, the droplets soaking into the stone as if it thirsted for more. The entity's burning eyes bore into him, daring him to finish what he had started. Mark's mind raced, recalling the details of the curse, the ritual that had bound the villagers' souls to this place. The journal had spoken of blood, sacrifice, and betrayal. But what if the only way to undo the curse was not with more blood, but by rejecting the darkness that had claimed the village? The thought crystallized in his mind. This curse had been born out of fear and greed, a pact made to summon power. Perhaps the only way to break it was through defiance, refusing to bow to the malevolent force before him. With a surge of determination, Mark lifted his gaze to the entity, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I won't give you what you want," he said, his voice ringing through the night. "I won't be part of this. The curse ends here." The entity let out a deafening roar, its form twisting and writhing in anger. The ground trembled violently, and for a moment, Mark thought he would be swallowed by the earth itself. But then, a crack of light split the darkness, and the figure recoiled, hissing in fury. The spirits that had once surrounded Mark began to fade, their sorrowful whispers growing faint. The village, once so oppressive and haunted, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The curse was breaking, but Mark wasn't out of danger yet. As the entity writhed in agony, the light from the altar grew brighter, casting long shadows across the village. Mark felt the weight of the curse lifting, the oppressive air beginning to ease. The spirits that had tormented him were vanishing, their chains to this land finally broken. For the first time since entering the village, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. But the dark entity wasn't finished. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, it lashed out at Mark, its shadowy form stretching toward him like a monstrous claw. Mark staggered backward, narrowly avoiding the attack as the ground beneath him split open. The village seemed to be tearing itself apart, as if the curse had been holding everything together. He sprinted toward the edge of the village, his heart pounding in his chest. The path, once hidden, began to reappear, the way out clear for the first time. Mark pushed forward, his legs burning with exertion, but he could feel the entity's rage at his back, the air crackling with its fury. Just as he reached the boundary of the village, he heard it. A whisper, soft and cold, brushing against his ear. "You may have escaped, but the curse is never truly broken." Mark stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He turned, glancing over his shoulder. The village was still, its ruins bathed in eerie moonlight. The shadows had receded, the dark entity seemingly defeated. But something about the whisper lingered in his mind, a reminder that ancient curses do not die easily. With one last look at the haunted village, Mark stepped into the forest, the path behind him slowly vanishing into the mist. As he made his way back to his truck, the whispers were gone, and the village once again seemed forgotten by time. But the chill in the air remained, a haunting reminder that some places are never truly free from the darkness. Are you craving more spine-chilling tales? Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to never miss a new story. Join us for more terrifying journeys into the unknown, where suspense and horror lurk around every corner. And don't forget to share your thoughts and suggestions for our next video in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned if you dare.